So here's what nobody tells you about Thanksgiving dinner. It's not the food that'll do you in, it's the seating arrangements. I ended up across from Jake Harland, which, I'll tell you what, that right there should have been my first clue the night was headed somewhere bad. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. The evening started normal enough. My husband Mark and I pulled into his parents' driveway in Chesapeake around 4:30, sun already dropping, cold wind coming off the water, that particular kind of gray Virginia sky that means everybody's gonna complain about it for the next 3 months. I remember climbing out of the passenger seat and just standing there for a second before I straightened up. My right knee had been giving me trouble all week. Old injury, nothing dramatic. Some mornings it's fine. Other mornings it reminds me exactly how old I'm not supposed to feel at 39. Mark looked over. You okay? I shut the car door. Yeah. He looked at me as another second. You sure? Yeah. Anyway, that probably should have been my first clue right there. When a simple question from your husband annoys you before you've even walked in the door, something's already off. Inside it was the usual situation. Football on in the living room. Kids running around with paper plates. Somebody had burned a batch of dinner rolls, and the whole house smelled like it. My mother-in-law was doing that thing where she pretended not to be stressed while very obviously being stressed. You know the look. For the first hour, everything was fine. I helped in the kitchen, talked to a few relatives, answered questions about work without actually talking about work. That's a skill you develop after enough years. Most people hear Navy, and they want to know what ships you've been on. Any crazy stories? Did you ever see combat? All of it. You learn to smile and redirect. Some things aren't classified. They're just mine. Around 6, everybody sat down. Adults at the long dining table, kids at the folding tables nearby. The whole extended family crammed into that split-level brick house they'd lived in for almost 30 years. Place always smelled like turkey and furniture polish. I ended up across from Jake Harland. That was unfortunate. Jake was 31, a Navy lieutenant, genuinely smart, talented. Also one of the most exhausting human beings I've ever had to share air with. Every conversation became about Jake, his accomplishments, his opinions, his plans, where he was going and how fast he intended to get there. His mother loved it. His father sat quietly. I noticed that about Robert Harland right away. Retired Navy Command Master Chief, around 70 sharp eyes, the kind of stillness you only get from a man who's been in enough rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment costs something real. Jake talked. Robert mostly listened. Now halfway through dinner, somebody asked how work was going. I said busy, which was apparently enough to give Jake an opening. He leaned back, smirked. Still flying? Sometimes. Depends on what's needed. That's the most officer answer I've ever heard. A couple people laughed. I smiled. No big deal. Then he kept going. You know what I always find funny? Nobody answered. That never stopped Jake. He gestured with his fork. I remember that specifically, the fork, and said the public has this image of military life, especially Navy officers. Then he looked directly at me. You're still in the Navy, right? Last time I checked. More laughter. Then he delivered the line. So what's your job these days? Let me guess. He grinned, posing for recruitment posters. A few people laughed, not everyone. Just enough. His mother said Jake in that tone that was supposed to sound corrective but wasn't, because she was smiling the whole time. That made it worse. Jake pointed the fork at me again and said, yeah, that was his expert analysis. My main career contribution was looking good in uniform. I stared at him, not angry, not yet. Mostly just tired, because I'd heard versions of that particular joke before. From strangers, from people who'd made up their minds about women in the military before they ever met one. It wasn't original. It wasn't even mean in any interesting way. It was just tired. Before I could respond, my husband's aunt jumped in. Oh, come on. Dana does photograph well. A few more laughs. I looked at Mark, just for a second. He was staring at his plate. I don't know how to explain why that hurt more than the joke, but it did. I wasn't expecting a speech. I wasn't expecting him to stand up and make a whole thing of it. One sentence would have been enough. Just one. Any sentence. He stayed quiet. Jake took that silence for surrender. Big mistake. He leaned forward. Hey, I'm kidding. A pause. Mostly, smaller laugh this time. Uneasy. And that's when I heard it. A fork touching a plate. Soft, metallic, deliberate. Robert Harland had set his down. Slowly, the table got quiet in that way tables do when everyone suddenly realizes they're watching something they don't quite understand yet. He looked at me. Not Jake. not anyone else. Me. Dana. Yes, sir. His voice didn't change pitch, didn't get louder. What was your call sign? Jake immediately snorted. Dad, come on. Robert ignored him. What was it? I thought about deflecting. I don't like talking about that part of my career. Haven't for years. But Robert waited, and something in the way he was holding very still made me answer. Jukebox. The reaction was immediate. Not from the table. From him. His eyes went just slightly wider. Not much, but enough that I noticed. Enough that Jake noticed too. Robert sat back. He looked at me the way I've seen senior officers look at a problem they've already solved in their heads. Jukebox. Mercer? I nodded once. Across the table, Jake frowned. What does that mean? Nobody answered. Robert held my eye for another second, then turned slowly toward his son. I couldn't see Robert's face from where I was sitting, but I didn't need to. Whatever Jake saw there, that was the end of the joke. He laughed nervously. Dad, what are you talking about? Robert shook his head, almost to himself. No idea, he said. Which, if you've ever been around that generation of senior enlisted, you know exactly what no idea means. The rest of dinner never really recovered. People tried to change the subject. Football, weather, travel plans. Nobody succeeded. And through all of it, I kept thinking about one thing. Not Jake. Not Robert. Not even the call sign. I kept thinking about Mark, because the man sitting beside me had watched the whole thing happen, and he hadn't said a single word. About 20 minutes later, I excused myself and walked down the hallway to the bathroom. I closed the door, looked in the mirror. I don't remember exactly what I said to myself. I don't think I said anything. I just stood there under that yellow light for a while, listening to relatives laugh down the hall, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Small. Not because of Jake. He was an idiot, and I'd known idiots before. What got me was the understanding that the evening wasn't really about a stupid joke. It was about what happens when the people closest to you decide your dignity is optional. I'd survived storms, bad deployments, one night I still can't talk about in detail. I'd been in situations that still visit me occasionally around 3 in the morning. And I was standing in my in-laws' bathroom, fighting tears under a cheap light fixture with a flickering bulb. I remember noticing the bulb, because my husband had stared at his plate. I turned the faucet on. Cold water. A few seconds. Then I dried my hands and went back out. The drive home was quiet in the way that settles in after something ugly happens, and nobody wants to be the first one to touch it. Outside Chesapeake was dark except for porch lights and Christmas decorations. People had already started putting them up the day after Thanksgiving, and we passed neighborhoods full of inflatable snowmen and those glowing reindeer that look vaguely accusatory at night. Inside the car, tires on asphalt. Occasional click of the turn signal. That was it. Somewhere around 20 minutes in, Mark sighed. Jake's an idiot. I kept looking out the window. Okay. What do you want me to say? I don't know, Mark. Maybe what you could have said 2 hours ago. He gripped the steering wheel. I'm saying he's an idiot. Yeah. Another minute. Then he said, he was joking. I turned toward him. You seriously? I'm not defending him. Sounds like it. I'm saying that's how Jake is. I laughed. One sound, not a happy one. That's your defense. It's not a defense. Then what is it? He didn't answer. We stopped at a red light. I looked at the dashboard clock. Something past 8. Normal Friday night for most people. For me it felt like something had moved, just slightly. The way a door that's been stuck for years finally comes unstuck, and you notice it immediately because of the sound. When the light turned green, Mark said, I didn't want to make Thanksgiving worse. There it was. For who? I asked. His jaw tightened. Dana. No, for who? He didn't answer because we both already knew. Not for me. The rest of the drive was silent. When we got home to our townhouse in Norfolk, I changed out of my clothes and cleaned up the kitchen. Didn't need cleaning. I do that when I'm upset. Keeps my hands moving. Keeps me from going somewhere in my head I don't need to go. Mark hovered nearby, trying to figure out whether he should talk or leave me alone, not really succeeding at either one. Eventually he leaned against the counter. Dana. I didn't look up. What? I'm sorry. I rinsed a coffee mug. For some reason that made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was so inadequate I didn't even know how to start. Sorry for what exactly? Dana. No, seriously. What specifically are you sorry for? I set the mug down. Because that word is doing a lot of work right now and I need to understand what's inside it. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. I should have said something. Yeah, I know. Do you? That landed harder than I meant it to. He looked tired. Honestly, so did I. We went back and forth for a while. He told me his family gets weird about military stuff. I told him his family got weird about me being respected. He didn't have a response for that. Around 10:30 we went to bed. Mark fell asleep fast. I didn't. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan, watching the shadows it made on the wall, which is one of those things that seems calm until you've been doing it for an hour, and you realize you're actually just marinating in everything you don't want to think about. At 1 in the morning I went downstairs and made coffee I didn't need. Sat at the kitchen table. Neighborhood completely quiet. And I found myself thinking about things I hadn't thought about in years. Not missions, not deployments. The aftermath, the physical cost, the stuff nobody mentions in recruitment commercials, the surgeries, the knee that never quite healed right, the lower back that showed up sometime around 36 and apparently decided to stay, the extra weight from my second deployment that refused to leave no matter how many miles I ran. I wasn't overweight. I was 39 and my body had a record of service longer than some of the officers I outranked. But sitting there at 1 in the morning with cold coffee, after the night I'd just had, I'll tell you what, that joke about the recruitment poster landed somewhere I hadn't expected. Not because Jake had any idea what he was saying, because the joke had a question buried in it, and the question was, is that what people actually see when they look at you? Around 2:30 I wandered into the bathroom for no particular reason. The scale was in the corner. I stared at it, then stepped on it. Regretted that immediately. I laughed at myself in the mirror, talking to no one. 2:30 in the morning, the man who humiliated me at dinner was probably sleeping fine, and I was standing on a scale in the dark. Climbed back into bed around 3. Didn't sleep. By morning I'd mostly decided I was angry instead of hurt, which is a trade I'll take every time. Mark was already downstairs when I came down. He'd made bacon, his version of a peace offering, and when I walked in he looked up with this careful expression like he was trying to read how bad it still was. Morning. Morning. I sat down, neither of us spoke. Then my phone buzzed. Family group text. I glanced at it. Message from Ellen Harland, Jake's mother. Something about what a lovely Thanksgiving. Let's all remember Jake was only teasing, and we love our military girls. Military girls. I was a 39-year-old lieutenant commander with thousands of flight hours and more years of service than Jake had been an adult. I stared at that phrase for a few seconds. Then I locked my phone. A few seconds later it buzzed again. Private message from Robert Harland. One sentence. I owe you an apology. Then another message appeared. So does my son. A pause, then a third. And maybe your husband does too. I read it twice. Something about that last one made me sit up straighter. Because for the first time since dinner, someone besides me had seen exactly what happened in that room. Not just the Jake part, all of it. The following Tuesday I met Robert for breakfast at a diner near Virginia Beach. Not one of the nice places, one of those old-school diners where the coffee arrives before you order it, and every waitress calls you honey. Parking lot was half full when I pulled in. Cold morning. That damp coastal chill that works through your jacket while you're walking from the car. Robert was already there, of course. The man was probably incapable of being late. Sitting in a booth near the window with black coffee, and a newspaper folded beside him that I don't think he'd actually been reading. He stood up when I walked in. That surprised me. Not many retired Command Master Chiefs stand up for anybody. I appreciated it. Morning, Dana. Morning. The waitress appeared, poured coffee, left menus neither of us looked at. For a while, neither of us said much. Robert stirred his coffee. Outside, a delivery truck was trying to parallel park and failing. Then he looked at me directly. I'm sorry. Just that. No setup, no explanation. Just sorry. I know, I said. I should have shut Jake down sooner. Probably. Long before Thanksgiving. He said it like it cost him something. I want you to know that. I leaned back. What does that mean, long before? He sighed. Over the next stretch of time, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes. He told me something I hadn't known. Jake hadn't started in on me at Thanksgiving. He'd been doing a version of it for years. Small comments at family gatherings, little jokes about women in uniform, about promotions, about what getting noticed really meant. Nothing that would make anyone file a complaint. Just enough repeated often enough to slowly build a story. Dana got lucky. Dana got noticed because she looked the part. Dana probably hadn't flown in years, that kind of thing. The more Robert talked, The more I understood why he had that expression, like a man who'd let something go on too long. "What did people say?" I asked. "When he said those things?" Robert hesitated. "That told me enough. Some of them believed him. He said it like he was apologizing for that too." I laughed. One short sound. They shouldn't have. No, but some did. That one sat there for a second, not because strangers believed it. Because family did. People I'd spent holidays with, people who'd smiled at me over turkey and asked polite questions about my career, and apparently, when I wasn't in the room, took Jake's version of it. The waitress came by and refilled the coffee. Neither of us touched it. Finally, Robert said, "I wanted you to hear it from me, because if this gets worse, you'll know where it started." Interesting choice of words. Not if Jake stops. Not if things get better. If this gets worse, like he already knew his son, which, to be fair, he did. After breakfast, I drove back toward Norfolk feeling heavier than when I'd arrived. Not broken, just tired. Tired of learning how long this had been going on. Tired of finding out how many people had preferred the easier story. That afternoon, I met my friend Renee Ortiz near base for coffee. Renee and I had known each other for years. Lieutenant commander, smart, direct in the way that usually skipped the part where she figured out if you wanted to hear something difficult. She took one look at my face when I sat down and said, "Oh, who do I need to hit with a truck?" I laughed for real for the first time in days. We sat outside despite the cold. Military people are weird like that. Put coffee in our hands and we'll sit anywhere. And I told her everything. The dinner, the jokes, the conversation with Robert, all of it. When I finished, she shook her head. "He's insecure." "I know." "No, I mean professionally insecure." She frowned. "There's a difference." She pulled out her phone, scrolled, then slid it across the table. I looked down, a promotional flyer, Joint Readiness Leadership Luncheon, Naval Station, Norfolk, a few weeks out. Guest presenters, senior officers, retired personnel, community leaders. And right there in the middle, Jake Harland. Featured speaker, Leadership in a Changing Navy. I stared at it, then looked at Renee. "Why, you're kidding." "Nope." I laughed. Not amusement, disbelief. "Leadership," I said. "That's the title." She smirked. Then her expression changed. Something crossed it, something I hadn't seen on Renee's face before. Which got my attention immediately, because Renee Ortiz does not do uncertain. "What?" She hesitated, reached back into her bag, pulled out her phone again, opened a photo, and handed it to me. The second I saw it, I started talking about whether I'd left the car unlocked. I don't know why, I just needed to be doing something else for a second. Then I actually looked. A presentation slide. Draft version, not final, but real. Blurred photograph in the center. Most people wouldn't have placed it. I did immediately because it was me, standing in uniform at a family barbecue from a couple years back. And underneath it, in clean presentation font, perception versus performance. When image gets ahead of experience. I read it twice. Then I read it again, thinking maybe I'd misread it. I hadn't. Renee watched my face. "I thought you should see it." "Yee? Where did this come from?" Someone reviewing the presentation flagged it. I stared at the image, my face, my photo. Used as a punchline. Used as the evidence for an argument Jake wanted to make at a Navy leadership luncheon at Naval Station Norfolk. A cold feeling settled in, not rage. Something sharper. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I stopped feeling hurt. I started paying attention. Because this wasn't family gossip anymore. This had crossed into something else, and suddenly I understood exactly what Robert had meant by, "If this gets worse." It already had. I didn't sleep much that night either. Not just because I was angry, though I was. Mostly I was trying to figure out what bothered me the most. Was it the photo? The caption? The fact that Jake had apparently been carrying this thing around for years? Or was it that if Renee hadn't shown me that slide, I never would have known any of it was happening? Around midnight, I ended up on the back patio with a blanket and a cup of coffee I definitely didn't need. Norfolk was quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the street once. Cold air rolled in off the water. I sat there and tried to be honest with myself. Part of me wanted revenge. Not accountability. Not justice. Revenge. The ugly version. The kind where you stop caring about consequences and just want somebody else to hurt for a while. I hated admitting that, but it was true. The problem was that every time I imagined doing something satisfying, another thought followed, what happens after? Because winning isn't always clean. Sometimes you win and still have to live with the fallout. And in this case, the fallout included my husband, my marriage, and a family I was going to see at Christmas. The next morning I showed Mark the slide. He just stared at it, silent. Then he looked at me, then back at the phone, his face drained of color. Oh, he said, just that. I laughed, genuinely for a second. Because after everything, somehow that one tiny word carried more weight than 100 apologies would have. That was the moment it became real for him, not a misunderstanding. Not family being family. Proof. Actual proof. Now do you get it? I asked. He nodded slowly. Yeah. You sure? Yeah. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. After a while he rubbed his forehead and said, "This is bad. That's your expert analysis." "I'm kidding. No, you're not." "Fair point." He stared at the slide again. "He actually used your picture." "Yep." Yee? What was he thinking? He wasn't. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I saw genuine anger on my husband's face. Not the defensive kind. Protective. And oddly enough, that made me sad, because where had that been 3 weeks ago? Eventually Mark looked up. "What are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? I still didn't know. That afternoon Renee called. "Did you show him?" "Yep." How'd he take it? Like a man who suddenly realized he'd been standing in the wrong line for 3 weeks. She laughed. Then her voice went serious. "Listen carefully. Whenever military people say, 'Listen carefully,' you should probably do that." "I talked to the event coordinator," she said. "The slide has already been flagged." My shoulders went tight. What does that mean? It means someone reviewing the presentation thought it was inappropriate. Good. It also means Jake was asked to remove it. I waited. Was he? A pause. He refused. For a second I thought I'd misheard her. He what? He argued. About a photo he didn't have permission to use. I got up from the couch, walked into the kitchen, back out, into the kitchen again. Sometimes movement helps me think. The coordinator escalated it. To several people, and in military language, several people is usually where bad days turn into bad weeks. After we hung up I sat quietly for a long time, because until that point this had mostly been personal. Family issue. Arrogant cousin, private insult, marriage problem. But Jake had been given a clear opportunity to correct it. And according to Renee, he doubled down. That mattered. Because arrogance is one thing. Refusing correction from a superior is another. That evening, around 6, Robert called. His voice sounded tired. I heard. I figured. A long pause. "I had a conversation with my son. How'd that go?" He laughed. Once, humorlessly. Poorly. Sounds about right. He's convinced everyone is overreacting." A pause. "He thinks people are attacking him." I leaned against the kitchen counter. Funny how that works. People who throw punches are always shocked when somebody notices. That got a slightly more genuine laugh. Then Robert said, "Dana, you planning to report him?" I thought about it. Longer than he probably expected. "I don't know," I said. "Good." "Oh, good? You're still thinking." He paused. "It means anger hasn't made your decision yet." I looked out the kitchen window. Sky going orange, sunset catching the rooftops. "Anger hasn't made your decision yet." That sentence stayed with me. The easy path would have been filing a formal complaint. There were probably 3 different regulations Jake had wandered into, maybe more. But every time I thought about formal punishment, something stopped me. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't fear. I wanted him exposed, not destroyed. There was a difference. A few days later, Renee met me near base for lunch. She was carrying a physical folder, actual paper, printed documents, which immediately made me nervous, because Renee only does that when she's about to show you something you can't unsee. "What is that?" "Information." "I hate when you say that." She slid into the booth, opened the folder. Event schedules, speaker lists, review notes, attendee information. I skimmed through it, then stopped. One name, Captain William Rollins, guest attendee. I looked up slowly. Renee was watching my face. "Are you okay?" I stared at the page. Captain Bill Rollins. The same name Robert had mentioned at the diner. The same man connected to a night I'd spent years trying not to revisit. The same man Jake clearly knew nothing about. A strange feeling settled over me. I don't know if I'd call it satisfaction. It was more like, you know how sometimes you don't realize you've been waiting for something until it's almost there? Something like that. "What are you thinking?" Renee asked. I looked at the attendee list again, then back at her. "The universe has a weird sense of humor," I said. She smiled. "That it does." The luncheon was 4 days away. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I wasn't thinking about what Jake had done. I was thinking about what would happen if he kept talking. And based on everything I knew about Jake Harland, he absolutely would. The morning of the luncheon started with rain. Not a storm. Just that particular Virginia drizzle that turns everything gray and makes traffic on the base worse than usual. I woke up before my alarm, somewhere around 5 in the morning, and lay there staring at the ceiling for a few seconds trying to remember why my stomach felt tight. Then I remembered. Beside me, Mark was already awake. I could tell by his breathing, by the way he was holding very still. Married people know. I rolled onto my side. Hey, you awake? A pause. Yep. Neither of us moved. Finally Mark said, "You don't have to go." I looked at him. That's not really an option. It could be. No. He nodded because he knew as I was right. My absence would have become part of the story, and I was done letting other people write stories about me. By 7:30 we were in the car headed toward Naval Station Norfolk. The rain had slowed to into a mist. Ships sat gray against the water. Traffic crawled through the gates. People in uniform moved between buildings with coffee cups and backpacks. Normal weekday military life, the kind I'd spent most of my adult years inside. For some reason, that comforted me. The base felt predictable, unlike family. The event was being held in a conference building near the waterfront. Nothing fancy. A large meeting room, rows of chairs, a projector screen, coffee stations along the back wall, and those round tables at the far end where people would sit for lunch afterward. When Mark and I arrived, the room was already filling up. Retired officers, active duty, civilian contractors, community leaders. The usual mix. I checked in, turned to scan the room, and spotted Robert almost immediately. He was near the front, coffee in hand, expression unreadable. When he saw me, he gave a small nod. Nothing more. I appreciated that. No last-minute conversation, no advice, just acknowledgement. Across the room, Jake was standing beside the projector, working the crowd. Laughing, shaking hands, completely at ease. He looked like a man who had absolutely no idea there was a cliff 2 steps behind him. Mark followed my gaze. How is he still smiling? Practice, I said. A few minutes later, Renee slid into the chair beside me. You okay? No. Good. If you were comfortable right now, I'd be worried. Fair enough. The room filled. At some point, the moderator welcomed everyone, introduced the speakers, thanked the sponsors. Standard stuff. Then Jake took the stage. And for the first 10 minutes, honestly, this is the frustrating part, he did well. Jake wasn't stupid. He wasn't incompetent. He was genuinely charismatic, comfortable in front of people, and the audience responded to it. People nodded, laughed at the right moments, took notes. I watched from my seat, and for a second, I almost wondered if I'd built him into something larger than he actually was. Then he kept talking. And Jake did what Jake always did when things were going well. He started believing his own performance. He moved into a section about leadership and public perception. The audience stayed with him. Everything still looked normal. Then he said, "One challenge facing today's military is image management." A few people nodded. I stared at my coffee cup. There was a ring on the table from where I'd set it down. I kept looking at that ring. Jake continued. The public loves a clean story, a clean uniform, a good photo. Across the room I could see Renee slowly fold her arms. Robert stared straight ahead. Jake clicked the remote. The next slide appeared. There it was. My photo blurred slightly but recognizable to anyone who knew me, and underneath it in clean white letters. Perception versus performance, when image gets ahead of experience. A few people in the room shifted in their seats. Not many. Just enough that Jake smiled, confident, relaxed, completely unaware. "We have to be careful," he said, "that we don't confuse visibility with value." Beside me, I felt Mark go still. His jaw tightened for a second. I thought about staying quiet. Seriously, I considered it. I could let the room move past it. I could leave afterward and never speak to Jake again. Easy, simple. No fallout with the family, no scene at a Navy luncheon, nobody talking about it on Monday. Then I thought about Thanksgiving, Mark's plate, the bathroom, the years of quiet little comments Robert had described over coffee at that diner. Every version of this I'd absorbed and let pass, because it wasn't worth the energy, because he wasn't important enough to engage, because I'd learned to smile and redirect. I was done redirecting. I stood up, not dramatically, just stood. The room noticed. Jake noticed. His smile went slightly uncertain. "Lieutenant Harland." His expression tightened. Then he pulled it back into something professional. "Yes, ma'am." I pointed toward the screen. "Who gave you permission to use that image?" Silence, complete. The kind that lands in a room of 200 people and just sits there. Jake glanced at the slide, then back at me. It's anonymized. That's not what I asked. the room got quieter somehow, which shouldn't have been possible. Someone behind me shifted in their chair. I heard it creak. Jake shifted his weight. It's being used as a general example. Of what? The smile was gone now. A leadership concept. What leadership concept? He started slipping. Not collapsing, Jake was too trained for that, but just slightly. Enough. The difference between image and performance, I nodded slowly. Did you verify the performance of the officer in that photograph? No answer. A few people in the audience exchanged looks. Jake laughed. Nervous, buying time. I think we're getting overly focused on the example. You used the example, more silence. Then a voice spoke from the front row. Old voice, calm, steady, the kind that doesn't need volume. That's a fair question. Every head in the room turned. Captain Bill Rollins stood up slowly from his seat, steadying himself with the cane beside his chair. Once he was standing, the room paid attention in a way that has nothing to do with rank. It's a different kind of thing. The kind that comes from having done something that people know about, even if they can't say exactly what it was. Jake looked confused. Rollins looked at the screen, then at Jake, then finally at me. Something crossed his face for just a second. Something I wasn't expecting, before he turned back to Jake. Do you know who that officer is? Jake swallowed. No, sir, I know. Rollins let that sit for a moment. Then, years ago, a lot of good people made good decisions during a very bad night. A pause. A man I cared about came home because of those decisions. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Rollins looked directly at Jake, and one of those people was her. Jake's face went pale. Not dramatically, just enough. Sir, he managed. I didn't know. Rollins nodded. Exactly. Those two words landed harder than anything louder could have. Because they were true and everyone in the room understood them. Jake didn't know. He'd never bothered to know. He'd made a judgment and built an argument on top of it and walked it into a room full of people, and he had no idea who he was talking about. Jake tried one more time. I wasn't criticizing her specifically. I spoke before Rollins could. Then why use my photo? Jake opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked toward the audience, toward the moderator, toward anyone who might throw him a line. Nobody did. Then Mark stood up. For the first time all morning, for the first time since Thanksgiving, Jake. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Take the slide down. Jake looked shocked. Mark, take it down. I stared at my husband. I wasn't expecting that, not there, not in that room, not from the man who'd stared at his plate 3 weeks ago. But there he was, finally on the right side of something. Jake looked trapped because he was, not by me, by his own decisions, stacked up one on top of the other. Then Robert stood, slowly, deliberately. The room went completely silent. Son. Jake turned. Dad, no. Robert's voice stayed calm, which somehow made it worse. I spent 30 years teaching sailors to respect the uniform. He looked at Jake, then at the slide, then back at his son. Somewhere along the way, you learned to respect attention more. Jake stared at the floor. The moderator quietly stepped forward and removed the slide. The projector changed. The image disappeared. Just like that. Gone. The damage remained. A few minutes later, the session ended early. People stopped. Conversations started. Quiet ones, the professional kind, the kind nobody wants to be the subject of. Outside, the rain had stopped. Clouds drifting slow over the harbor. I stood near the parking lot watching ships in the distance, and eventually Jake came out. Alone. No audience. No microphone. He stopped a few feet away. Ah, you happy now? For the first time, I didn't see the version of Jake who laughed too loud and filled every room he walked into. I saw something underneath it, something younger and more afraid. No, I said. He frowned. Ye? Then what was the point? I thought about it for a second. About Thanksgiving, about the slide, about years of small comments that had been building a story about me in rooms I wasn't invited into. The point is, I said, you don't get to make me smaller just because you're scared you aren't big enough. Jake had absolutely nothing to say to that. And for once in his life, the silence was his problem, not mine. I walked back to where Mark was waiting. He didn't say anything right away. Neither did I. We just started walking toward the car, and the harbor was behind us, and somewhere out on the water a ship was moving slow through the mist, and I remember thinking, I'm gonna have to get my knee looked at. It was starting up again on the walk out. That's the thing I remember fixating on. My knee. Not what had just happened. My knee. For a while after that, things got worse before they got better. That's probably the part most people don't expect. The story looks like it ends at the confrontation. It doesn't. That's usually where the real mess begins. By Saturday afternoon, 2 days after the luncheon, half the family had already picked a side, and some of them didn't pick mine. My phone started going off while I was making coffee. Text after text. Mark's aunt, his sister, a cousin from Richmond I only saw twice a year, who somehow had a detailed opinion about everything that had happened, despite not being anywhere near Norfolk. Most of them had missed the part where Jake used my photograph without permission. What they focused on was the uncomfortable outcome. Apparently, I had embarrassed him. Funny how that works. The person causing the problem gets sympathy. The person exposing the problem gets a message from Ellen Harland saying she wished I could have handled things with a little more grace because family should protect family. I read that one twice. Then I set the phone face down on the counter. Not because I was angry. Because I was tired, and there comes a point where you stop explaining obvious things to people who have already decided. Mark walked in, looked at my face, looked at the phone. Bad? Depends on what we're measuring. I poured coffee. Honesty or popularity. That got a small smile out of him. First one I'd seen in days. The smile didn't last long, because there was still something sitting between us that we hadn't fully dealt with. That evening we sat on the back patio. Weather had finally cleared. Cool air, clear sky. A cargo ship moved slow through the distance beyond the river. We just sat there for a while, both of us looking out at the water, not saying anything, listening to the neighborhood settle down for the night. Then Mark said, "I owe you an apology." "I know." "No." His voice sounded different. More certain, a real one. That got my attention. I turned toward him. He took a breath. "When Jake went after you at Thanksgiving, I was thinking about keeping the peace. I know. I thought staying quiet was the safest option. I know that too." He looked at me directly. "I understand now that I wasn't protecting peace." He swallowed. "I was protecting myself." Neither of us spoke for a moment. The honesty surprised me. Not because I didn't believe it, I did, but because uncomfortable truths are usually the real ones, and most people spend their whole lives avoiding them. Finally I said, "Yeah." He nodded. "I know." Then, and this was new, the old version of him would have smoothed past it, moved on, considered the apology delivered and the subject closed. He didn't stop. "I should have backed you up." "You should have. I was wrong." "Yes." A sad look crossed his face. "You're really making me earn this. You've had 3 weeks to prepare." That finally got a real laugh out of both of us, the first genuine one since Thanksgiving. It didn't last long, but it was real, and that counted for something. Then Mark went serious again. "I don't expect you to get over it overnight." "Good. I just need you to know I understand." I looked at him for a long moment. "I believe you," I said. Relief crossed his face. Before he could say anything else, I added, "But I need different, not sorry." The relief disappeared, replaced by something quieter, more serious, understanding, which was exactly what I wanted. Because apologies matter. Changed behavior matters more. Over the next few months, things slowly settled, not perfectly. Jake's presentation was reviewed. Questions were asked. His promotion package didn't move forward that year. Nobody publicly destroyed him. Nobody ended his career. That wasn't the goal. But people started paying closer attention. And sometimes that's enough. The funny thing was that the professional consequences seemed to bother Jake less than the personal ones. For the first time in his life, people stopped automatically believing him. That was new territory for him, especially with his father. Robert and I talked occasionally after that, short conversations usually, baseball, weather, Navy stories that somehow always turned into something else by the end. One afternoon he called and said, "You know, he's miserable." I laughed. I figured he deserved some of it. A pause. Coming from Robert, that was practically a statement. Then he added, "But not forever." I understood exactly what he meant. Accountability isn't the same thing as permanent punishment. Good leaders know the difference. About 3 months later, I got a phone call from Jake. I almost didn't answer. I stared at the name on the screen for probably 4 or 5 rings, and then curiosity won, the way it always does. "Hello." Silence. Then, "Hey." His voice sounded different. Less polished, less certain, like something had been sanded off it. "What do you need, Jake?" A long pause. I wanted to apologize. I sat down. Genuinely, I hadn't expected it. I'd heard apologies before, empty ones, performed ones, the kind designed to make the apologizer feel better, rather than the person they'd wronged. I was braced for one of those. "I know," I said. Another pause. I was out of line. I waited. "I spent a long time convincing myself you were the problem." The words sounded like they cost him something, like he wasn't used to saying them and his mouth wasn't quite shaped right for it. I was jealous. That one surprised me. Oh, jealous? Yeah. I didn't interrupt. For once, Jake seemed to be trying to finish a thought without me or anyone else in the room, and I let him. You never had to tell people how important you were. A pause. You never chased attention. Another pause. And people still respected you. I looked out the window. Late afternoon light across the backyard. Somewhere nearby a lawnmower was running. Normal life. The kind that keeps moving whether you're watching it or not. Finally Jake said, I used you to make myself feel bigger. There it was. The truth. Not the polished version. Not the version where he reframes it as a misunderstanding or a lesson about communication. The actual thing. I sat quietly for a few seconds. Then I said, that's the most honest thing to that to me. A short laugh came through the phone, not happy, just honest. Another pause. Can we start over? I thought about it, long enough that he probably got nervous. No, I said, silence, but we can start from here. The relief in his voice was immediate. And here's the part I didn't expect. I felt it too. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Not even close. Jake and I weren't going to become friends. The Harlan family was still going to have complicated Thanksgivings for years. But the pretending was over. And that was something. A few weeks after that call, I found myself down at the waterfront in Norfolk just after sunrise. I don't remember why exactly. It was early, my knee was giving me trouble again, probably not the best morning for a walk. The harbor was quiet. Water moving slow under the morning light. Ships sitting dark at their moorings. I stood there for a while. My knee hurt. My jacket felt a little tight. I'd been meaning to do something about that for a while. And for the first time in months, none of that bothered me. I stood there and thought about the years behind me. The decisions, the cost of them. The people who'd come through them alongside me, and the ones who hadn't. I thought about a night a long time ago that I still can't talk about in detail, and a man named Rollins who'd stood up in a conference room with a cane and said 6 words that did more than anything I could have managed myself. I thought about Mark, who'd finally stood up too, later than he should have, but he stood. And I thought about the fact that the deepest wounds I'd carried didn't come from storms or hard landings or anything I'd trained for. They came from a dinner table, from people who knew my name, from finding out how many people had preferred the easier story about me. The thing about that, and I've thought about this a lot since, is that it didn't break me. I won't pretend it didn't hurt because it did, but it didn't break me, and I think there's something worth sitting with in that. Not a lesson exactly, more like a fact. You find out who people are when the moment costs something. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is just stay exactly who you are long enough for the truth to catch up. I stood there until the light changed and the harbor got busier, and eventually I walked back to my car. Knee complaining the whole way.